Hello. This lecture is about interest groups, and in particular about lobbying. Before we talk about lobbying too much, it's important to start off by sort of getting an idea of what an interest group is. And an interest group doesn't have to be a sinister thing. It can be any group of people that are bound together by a common interest. Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts are interest groups. Churches and other religious organizations are interest groups. But we also shouldn't limit our thinking to sort of nonprofit or philanthropic groups. The Better Business Bureau is an interest group. There's an organization known as the Small Business Association. That is an interest group. Likewise, unions are interest groups, and to some extent, any major corporation is its own interest group. It's important to understand interest groups because often in the political system, what you find is that individuals come together as an interest group with a particular issue that they would like to bring before government. Thus, for example, and perhaps not surprisingly, the Small Business Association of America comes together to try to to convince government about the needs and concerns of small businesses. When they do this, and you can do this any number of ways, interest groups can come together to help government or to make government aware of their issues on any number of ways, starting with spreading information among their membership and convincing their membership to get in touch with their representatives. So, for example, you may have in your lifetime gotten a letter that sort of said, if this is of interest to you, contact your congressperson. In addition, they may sort of spread, get email campaigns going or things like that. These are things that interest groups do. They may also take out advertising in newspapers or on the internet or on the media to sort of tell Congress, and in Washington in particular, Washington, D.C. is a rather surreal place because you will find all kinds of ads that are not out to convince you as an individual to buy anything, the way ads are around pretty much anywhere else in the country, but are advertisements very directly targeting members of Congress as they walk around the streets of Washington, D.C. and ride in the subway system and so on. So advertising is an important thing that interest groups do as a way of sort of getting their word out to members of Congress. In addition, interest groups sometimes convince their membership to go to Washington, D.C. or just to local offices of government representatives to meet with the representatives and talk about the issues and concerns that these interest groups have. But finally, and perhaps most, notoriously in our minds, interest groups hire lobbyists. Lobbyists, I pause perhaps now is a good time to sort of reflect on the fact that lobbyists are not nearly as sinister as we think they are. I was pausing and reflecting on the fact that I have probably in some level had a lobbyist working for me, or at least for an interest group that I was a part of, since the time I was 7 or 8. And have had probably over the course of my lifetime several different lobbyists working indirectly for me. Some of you may be shocked or aghast at this, but I'm willing to bet that the same is true for you as well. How can I come to this random, statement that since the time I was 7 or 8 I've had lobbyists working for me? Well, when I was about 7 years old, I joined a church. I was a Sunday schooler. This particular church was part of a large denomination, and most large church bodies in the United States have lobbyists working for them. Mount Aloysius is a Catholic school. The Catholic College of Bishops has lobbyists working for them. They actively lobby Congress. Having gotten a PhD from Catholic University, I've seen them do that. Catholics are not the only ones who do this, however. The Lutherans, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, I believe the American Baptists, a number of other large Protestant Christian groups lobby Congress, as do a number of large Jewish organizations, as do the Muslims. And I'm willing to bet, though I don't know this firsthand, a number of other faith traditions lobby Congress as well. So when I was 7, I started Sunday school at my local church. I put, my quarter or my dollar in the offering plate. Part of that money eventually went to go support a lobbyist. That was my first lobbyist. When I was 13, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness, and accordingly, my family began contributing to the local the organization that supports and fosters research for the cure of that particular chronic illness. Most such organizations also have lobbyists. Think things like the Susan J. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation is probably one that you're very familiar with. But almost any other organization, the organization that any organization that looks at researching into chronic illnesses, so the Cystic Fibrosis Association, the American Lung Association, the American Heart Association, all of these organizations also wind up supporting, in no small part, lobbyists in Congress, who once again make Congress aware of the issues around that they need to support medical research. When I got to be 18, I had a job that was, I worked at a local grocery store in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania being a union state, I was pretty much the day I was hired, I was made part of the local labor union in this grocery store. Unions have lobbyists. That was a summer job, so after that I stopped having that as a lobbyist, but by the time I became a graduate student, I became a member of the American Political Science Association. Well, the American Political Science Association also has lobbyists. They lobby in Congress on issues of academic freedom and freedom of speech. I now again sort of work for a church, and so once again I've got a lobbyist on that. And my guess is, like I said, while I'm talking about this firsthand from what I've experienced, I'm willing to bet that many of you might also have a lobbyist or two that you are supporting through church plate offerings, through membership in professional organizations, through membership in unions, through membership in clubs and other activities that you find important in your lives. Odds are most of you have at least one lobbyist that you are indirectly, for maybe a couple of pennies a year supporting. Having said that, let's talk a little bit about what lobbying is. The word lobbying originally comes from the fact that people who wanted to sort of talk to members of Congress would wait in the lobby of the halls of Congress for their particular senator or representative to come out of session, and then they would grab that person and try to convince them to vote one way or another. That's not how lobbying works anymore. Nowadays, what happens is that lobbyists are generally, actually almost exclusively, lawyers who go set up appointments to meet with representatives and talk about the issues that are of concern to the people that they represent. Sometimes this happens in formal meetings in the offices of the representatives. Sometimes this happens at fundraisers. Sometimes this happens in any number of other ways. It is helpful to sort of think about, well, if you were going to be a lobbyist, how would you want to sort of talk to, how would you convince a congressperson to sort of meet with you and convince them about what your issues are? There are, and your book doesn't really go into this too much, there are some unwritten rules about lobbying, and it's kind of interesting to know what they are. Lobbyists have learned, I'm going to sort of talk about 5 basic rules. Lobbyists learn these fairly early. And the first and foremost of these rules is to never make enemies. One of the things that happens is that some members of Congress can be there for 10, 15, 20 years, And so if you say something bad about one congressperson or senator, Senator Smith never votes my way, and you say that in anger, you never know when Senator Smith will find out about this or how long Senator Smith will stay in office. So it's important to sort of lobbyists learn to remain very professional, recognizing that even though Senator Smith may not vote on this issue, at some point they may have some other issue that's of importance that you need to meet them on. The second thing that lobbyists have learned, and it's kind of related to this, is to never lie or even to exaggerate. Lobbyists can be effective only because they build relationships with people in Congress. And so people in Congress need to be able to count on it when a lobbyist comes and says that they represent 10,000 farmers from the Plains states or something like that. The member of Congress needs to believe that there really are 10,000 voters that are keyed into this issue. If it turns out that the lobbyist has exaggerated and it turns out there are only, 500 voters, well, that lobbyist doesn't stand for very much. And how can a member of Congress ever trust them again? Lobbyists, much as we like to think of them as sort of being kind of the slimy underbelly, buying votes and whatnot, they are actually very much professionals. They have statements that they come up with, they have positions that they must adhere to, and they have a series of facts and sort of talking points that help them to sort of convince Congress of why a particular person should vote a particular way on a particular issue. That said, part of being a lobbyist, as I've mentioned, is to be a professional. And that means that lobbyists also need to be willing to compromise and to recognize other people's positions. A lobbyist is never going to be a my way or the highway kind of a person. They are, however, going to be able to sort of say, well, these are the issues that my particular constituency represents. The people who are paying for me to come here need these three things. They're willing to compromise and say, as long as we've got these three things, they might also be willing to allow other things to happen. But if those key 3 points aren't met, then they usually have to go and talk to their constituency before promising anything. That being willing to compromise is a third element of lobbying. A fourth is to be prepared to pick your battles. That means that if there's a very big issue that your constituency wants and two smaller issues, all of which are going to be in a single bill, a smart lobbyist will meet with the key members that he represents in advance and sort of say, okay, how much are we willing to give up in order to get our key issue? Are we willing to give up our stance on these two side issues or not? And that, in the end, is sort of the fifth key rule of lobbying, knowing where the members stand. You never want to be the lobbyist who inadvertently sort of sells out the people you represent by being willing to compromise in a way that your members aren't. Conversely, you also never want to be the lobbyist who winds up misrepresenting their constituency to an extent that people don't trust them. You also want to know how the members of Congress stand and be able to accurately reflect what they want as well. Lobbyists work basically on relationship. Lobbyists work on having the information that a congressperson needs to be able to understand the piece of legislation that's before them. And lobbyists work by making sure that the different constituencies are able to understand why a particular piece of legislation will affect them or not. I want you to think back for a minute to that Congress simulation that we all did in class. A number of you, I recall, sort of said that, this piece of legislation, even though it looked fairly easy at first, it was important to sort of read through everything and make sure you understood what it meant. The job of a lobbyist in that particular situation would have been to go and represent, for example, the coal industry, or conversely, the coal mining union, and represent and talk to you as a representative of Congress to explain what the effect of this legislation would have been on the average coal miner in a state, or to explain what the effect of this particular piece of legislation, these scrubbers, what the cost of that would have been to the power industry, and how much the price of electricity would have gone up if that legislation had passed. That's the role of a lobbyist, to provide the information that Congress needs to make decisions. Conversely, a lobbyist also works with a union or an industry group, for example, to help them understand what types of things Congress might be willing to consider. Back when I worked in Washington, I sat in on a whole lot of strategy sessions, enough of them, where the leader of my particular group that I was working for met with other leaders of other groups that had sort of similar interests to talk through what were their important issues and which senators might be willing to support or write legislation that would help them resolve their particular issues. I hope that's all clear. There are, as your book notes, two different kinds of lobbying: inside lobbying and outside lobbying. Inside lobbying is basically when a group kind of creates an interest or a sort of network between an interest group, a government agency, and Congress. The classic version was sort of what was known as an iron triangle. Groups that had sort of a common feeding thread. Think of something as like, well, the Defense Department was notorious for this. Because there would be, on the one hand, a very small and select group of people who manufactured things like airplanes and ships that they sold to the Department of Defense. And there's actually very few companies that make things like fighter planes. That was one sort of corner of that triangle. The second corner of that triangle would be the government agency, in this case the Department of Defense, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, that needed new equipment and needed it fairly regularly. And then the third corner was Congress, which had the ability to provide the money to allow the Defense Department to buy the new thing that it needed. Inside lobbying was sort of this iron track between these groups. And this particular sort of iron triangle would sort of feed into itself. On some level, these people began to sort of see each other on such a regular basis that they knew that, member of Congress would know that whenever the Navy needed a new ship, well, it was going to go to one of two different companies to sort of talk about it, to buy it. So they would then automatically sort of know who the representatives of those two companies were, and call them up to sort of see how much something would cost or what the possibility was of doing things. However, these iron triangles also came up slightly less naturally through appointments. And it is still not all that uncommon, for example, for a former senator to then become the lobbyist for a particularly large and well-funded interest group, or conversely, for a particularly loyal worker of an interest group to go and represent or to go work as a staff member for Congress. This inside iron triangle thing worked somewhat well. However, nowadays, what we see more and more of are what are known as policy networks. These are far more temporary in the recognition that interests come and go. So you may see a policy network on something like immigration reform or finance reform or right now banking reform. This is more of a sort of a couple of different organizations, businesses, or other interest groups come together with a couple of like-minded members of Congress and perhaps a couple of a couple of federal agencies that have oversight into them to work out a policy area that will help them. However, this recognizes that these groups will only combine on some issues and not others. An example, I think probably the best example that might come up for you all or might be relevant to you all is that, for example, every so often the Department of Labor starts thinking about changing either the minimum wage or the workday. Well, when that happens, unions have a very definite stake in making sure that, for example, minimum wage goes up on a fairly regular basis and that labor standards, people are allowed to take breaks on a fairly regular basis. There may also be other groups that are similarly inclined to sort of think in favor of workers and make sure that they have rights. Likewise, the Department of Labor will want to make sure that it can sort of talk to the people who are stakeholders, like the unions, like small businesses, etc. However, the Department of Labor has oversight over a lot more things than just setting minimum wage standards. Likewise, unions have a lot more interests than just setting minimum wage standards. So they will come together as a policy network on this one particular issue, but they will probably have nothing at all to do with each other on other issues. This is what is inside lobbying. Inside lobbying, therefore, either through the Iron Triangle or through policy networks, are when people come together that represent both the government and outside interest groups and members of Congress to sort of work together. The opposite of sort of the inside lobbying is outside lobbying. These are efforts by interest groups to meet with Congress and to convince Congress of an issue that Congress might not otherwise be considering. There are ways of doing this. Most commonly, interest groups will resort to what's known as grassroots activism. They will send out newsletters trying to convince their members to sort of contact Congress members. They will use the internet to sort of send emails and so on. More and more, however, interest groups will also sort of lobby together to form a PAC, a PAC, that's a political action committee, which will sort of solicit campaign contributions and others, which they will then give to members of Congress who are particularly inclined towards them. This type of money and this type of fundraising serves a couple of key purposes. It is, first and foremost, a way of ensuring that favorable legislators remain or get into office. If you are an interest group and you have a senator who has supported you a lot over the years, you want to make sure that that person stays in office. You don't want to risk that this person gets voted out and some other stranger who might be sort of opposed to you gets in. On the other hand, if there's a congressperson that who has not particularly worked well for you, with whom you do not see eye to eye, it might be in the interest of a PAC to sort of support a challenger in the election. However, PAC money also shows the legislator and a way that this particular interest group appreciates the support that's being shown. It convinces the legislator that his or her efforts on this particular issue are not in vain. And it's important to realize that what the money does is that it provides access. I think I told you in my introductory get to know you, I forget whether it was an email or a lecture, I sort of mentioned that I had at one point in my Washington career attended one of those famed $5,000 a plate breakfasts in Washington, D.C. This was a PAC breakfast. So in order to be able to attend this particular breakfast, somebody contributed $5,000 to sit at the table with, in this particular case, it was 2 senators and 1 staffer from the Senate office. And there were about 20 people in that particular room. It was the $5,000 went to these senators' campaign coffers so that they could go and try to get reelected. However, it was also an opportunity for the people who were seated around the table to have about an hour and a half one-on-one with these senators and to sort of talk to the senators about what was going on in their lives and how, actually it was about two particular bills that were up in the Senate at that time, how those two particular bills would affect their lives. That's what a PAC does. There's a couple of other things that interest groups do beyond simply lobbying, and some of them are somewhat surprising, but worth keeping in mind. One of the things that increasingly organizations do, interest groups do, is that they can fund studies or conduct surveys. And I mentioned this, and I mentioned a couple of other things. I'll mention a couple of other things as well, because it's worth being aware of as you all are starting to think about your papers. Because when an interest group funds a study or when an interest group conducts a survey, they will do it admittedly in an unbiased way, but they will ask questions and they will conduct a study to bolster their argument. A rather famous example that came up about 10 years ago was that an organization that was in support of treating animals humanely came up with a survey, and the results of their survey were that something like 70% of Americans surveyed believed that household pets should be treated kind of like children in the family. And this seems kind of strange. This was, of course, in support of their argument because they were sort of trying to convince Congress to pass legislation that would support animal rights and animal welfare. But if it sounds a little bit strange, like, if you were surveyed, you would certainly never treat an animal like a child. I don't put my cat in a diaper, for example. It's worth realizing that the way they came up with this was that they conducted a survey, and the question was simply this. Do you believe, here's a multiple choice question, do you believe an animal should be treated as A, an inanimate object, B, just a piece of something that has no feelings or thoughts, or 3, as a child or member of the family? Well, given those options, everyone chose the third option. However, you could argue that this particular survey was a little bit biased. They did it because this survey was biased in part because it was who funded it. And I've seen a number of groups that sort of fund surveys that with not necessarily inherent bias in them, but certainly sort of rigged to sort of favor their particular outcome. Other things that interest groups do, they provide examples for hearings and testimony. So if Congress wants to look at questions of safety in a particular industry, if Congress wants to look at why medical research should be conducted in a particular way, if Congress wants to look at any type of issues, they will sometimes conduct surveys. Well, if an interest group knows, Congress will conduct a hearing. If an interest group knows about this hearing in advance, and interest groups do because these types of hearings are advertised to the public in advance, the interest group will make sure that somebody that will reflect their point of view will be asked to testify at this hearing. Interest groups also contact the media from time to time, and interest groups track the issues and study the impact of them. So, for example, some of the stuff that I've been asking you to do in your papers, where I, for example, asked you to take a look at how many bills had been proposed in Congress on your issue, that was something that I used to do as part of my work for an interest group. Why? Because it was very important when we had 5 different bills up in subcommittee. There was one that was particularly favorable to my interest group, I believe 2 that we could have tolerated and 2 that we were absolutely opposed to. It was really important to make sure that we could A, contact Congress and tell them, look, you need to support this one and not this one, even they look largely the same, there's a significant difference. And B, if we noticed that Congress was supporting one of the ones that we didn't like so much as opposed to one of the ones we did, we would certainly call the people, the members of Congress that usually supported us and make them aware of sort of the differences. Also, we would sort of fund studies of the impact of what these different bills would do. So that's in some sort of what an interest group can do or should or wants to do. As I've said, whether to the extent this is helpful or constitutional is somewhat of a live issue. And one of the things to sort of think about is who can afford to have these kinds of lobbyists and interest groups. It's helpful to realize, as I said, large religious organizations often have them. Smaller churches may not. Large industries tend to have them. Unions have them because they're largely funded by union dues. But the average worker who's working at a small mom-and-pop store probably does not. In fact, even the small mom-and-pop store, depending on how much money it has, may not be able to contribute dues to the Small Business Association to be able to fund a lobbyist. People who argue against lobbying or who are troubled by lobbying note that lobbying, once again, is something that is a lot easier to do if you have a lot of money and a lot of spare time. People who tend to be at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, people who work very long hours for very little pay, also have very little time to be part of an interest group, have very little time to write a letter to a member of Congress, and certainly don't have the money to sort of afford a lobbyist to go lobby on their behalf. The Supreme Court has consistently upheld the fact that lobbying and this type of activity is political speech, and so has generally sort of argued against limiting it. But the question is then, have we tipped the scale? That's the final thought I will leave you with. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. And I look forward to hearing from you in other fora. Bye-bye.